and welcome to a new webinar, which we are publishing to continue the theme on strategically engaging with the UN human rights mechanisms. Today, we're going to be talking about the New York mechanisms so that you're able to better understand the UN human rights system in New York and the different mechanisms and bodies that exist there, which you might potentially want to engage in your future advocacy work. So as always, this is a pre-recorded webinar, so please do feel free to pause the video at any moment, take notes, write down your thoughts. It's a really important part for your learning, so please do that whenever you want to. Today we're going to be talking about the New York mechanisms, and specifically, before I unveil the main objectives from our side for this session, maybe just take a few minutes now and write down 3 key things that you would like to learn by listening to this webinar. So is there something in particular that one of the bodies that you'd like to learn more about, or general questions more on an ecosystem level? Just write down what you're hoping to gain from this. And then once you're ready, and play the video again, and then we'll continue on with it. So today we're going to be talking about generally having a better understanding of the 5 bodies and mechanisms in New York that address human rights issues. So Tess, who I'll be introducing just in a minute, will be running through with us the NGO committee, so talking about that, the 3rd committee, the Commission on the Status of Women, the high-level political forum, and the Security Council. She'll be running through all of those with us. And so before I formally introduce our speaker for today, who is Tess McAvoy, I also wanted to briefly introduce Marina, who you'll see on the webinar here with us as well. Marina helped put together this presentation. And she joined ICHR in September of last year, so September 2019. And she has experience engaging with the 3rd committee, with the NGO committee, and also attending some Security Council sessions. So many thanks to her for helping with this presentation. And thank you for joining us, Marina. So our speaker today is Tess. She is a program manager and a legal counsel here at ICHR. And Tess leads our work on LGBTI rights defenders, and she also leads our legal protection work. So her work contributed to developing the model law for the protection of human rights defenders. So she's a part of our legal team. So she engages with strategic litigation for the protection of human rights defenders. And she also engages with the UN mechanisms in New York, including the General Assembly and the Commission on the Status of Women. So she is actually based in New York. And before joining ICHR, Tess worked with leading international law firm DLA Piper, and she also worked with community legal centers working on women's and refugee rights. So we're really pleased today to have Tess join us and guide us through this discussion. And on that note, Tess, I will hand it over to you.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, all of you. So we don't have a huge amount of time to discuss these mechanisms, but what we're trying to get out of this is to really give you a bit of a sense of what mechanisms exist and kind of a general understanding of the kind of issues they look at. You've gone through a number of sessions so far, focused in Geneva, and as you know, the kind of key human rights bodies of the UN are situated in Geneva, in the Human Rights Council, Special Procedures, UPR, treaty bodies. And then there's this whole other world that exists in New York. And I remember previously to working in our New York office, I did work in our Geneva office. And to me, this whole world was just, I didn't even know what that was. And so now I've kind of got a much better understanding of how the two fit together. But it's really important, we think, for you to have an understanding of the both, but a really more detailed understanding of how they engage in the Geneva mechanisms. So the first image you'll see here is the UN system. So there are so many different elements of the UN system. As you'll see, this map is huge and has a lot of small writing and so many different bodies and mechanisms. And as you know, they fall under kind of 3 key themes, that is development, peace and security, and human rights. In this session, we're going to discuss a couple of specific mechanisms that exist within New York They are the Security Council. So this is one of the 6 principal organs of the UN. There, along with some others, including the General Assembly and the Economic, Social, Cultural Council. So Hannah has put her mouse over the Security Council there. You should see that there. So it's one of the 6 key bodies of the UN. We're also going to talk a little bit about the 3rd Committee of the General Assembly, and that sits right there under main committees, under subsidiary organs, the kind of top left, the big green box circled in green. So the 6 main committees, we're going to talk specifically about the 3rd committee. The High Level Political Forum, which is quite a new mechanism, and that's right there, which sits under the Security Council and the General Assembly. We'll also talk about the Commission on the Status of Women, which sits under the ECOSOC functional committees, exactly there, and the NGO committee, which sits under other bodies under the Economic and Social Council. So the intention behind showing this image of all the bodies was to highlight the enormity of the UN and to show how many mechanisms and bodies sit within it, and also to give you a bit of a sense how these bodies fit within the UN framework. Now on the next slide, you can see a little bit more detail in terms of the human rights mechanisms of the UN. And so you can see here at the top left, the Security Council. I'm going to ask Hannah to again point there. Then we also have the High Level Political Forum, kind of perfectly sitting between the General Assembly and ECOSOC. The Human Rights Council as a subcommittee of the General Assembly. Also, you see there the 3rd committee as one of the subcommittees, just to the left down there, of the General Assembly. You see the Committee on the Status of Women kind of falling a little bit, floating in the air there under the ECOSOC body. And so this also can kind of highlight to you as well, like how the Geneva bodies all fit together as well. So you've got the Council together with UPR, Special Procedures and Complaints Procedure all there. And then the treaty-based bodies a bit separate. So you would have learnt a lot about all of those, but this kind of gives you a bit more of understanding of all the other ways in which the UN does look at issues of human rights. So we'll start by talking briefly on the Security Council. What I think is really important just to say at the outset is that ISHR engages really closely with both the 3rd committee as well as the NGO committee. We engage much less closely with the Security Council, CSW, and the High Level Political Forum, but we want to talk to you about those 3 today to give you a sense of what they are and what they do, but also because we've found in previous HERDAPs that these are sessions that participants have been interested in or have engaged with in their advocacy or wanting to learn a little bit more about. So we've included them in here, but while ISHR doesn't engage hugely with each of these mechanisms, we're part of coalitions of NGOs that do engage and do follow those discussions within those mechanisms and bodies. So, as I said previously, there are 6 main organs of the UN. The Security Council is one of those main organs that has primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. The Security Council itself has 15 state members, and 5 of them are permanent. That includes the US, the UK, Russia, China, and France. And the other 10 mechanisms, they each rotate. And the interesting thing about the Security Council is that all members of the UN agree to accept and carry out decisions of the Security Council. So while other organs of the UN make recommendations to member states, only the Security Council has the power to make decisions that member states are obliged to implement. So when a complaint concerning a threat to peace is brought to the Security Council, it usually recommends that the party try to reach agreement peacefully. The Council may also undertake investigation and mediation, dispatch a mission, a peacekeeping mission, appoint a special envoy, or request the Secretary General to help to achieve a settlement or dispute. So some examples of the way in which the Council has done this include the appointment of a mediator to negotiate mutually acceptable terms for a ceasefire between the UK and Argentina on the Falkland Islands. That was in 1982. The Commission of Experts established to examine reported violations of international humanitarian law, in the former Yugoslavia in 1992. And the Commission of Experts established concerning Rwanda in 1994. as well as the International Commission for Inquiry for Darfur in 2004. So kind of can see in the way in which the Security Council has engaged in a number of really kind of critical key conflicts throughout history. When a dispute leads to hostilities, the Security Council seeks to bring them to an end as soon as possible. So in those circumstances, the Council may issue ceasefire directives to help prevent escalation of conflict and also dispatch military observers or peacekeeping forces. The other thing the Security Council can opt for is enforcement measures. So that includes economic sanctions, arms embargoes, financial penalties and restrictions, travel bans, severance of diplomatic relations, or even collective military action. So while we're not going to talk about this body in much detail, we thought that it was useful for you to know that it exists and have a basic understanding of its purpose and the way that it has engaged and worked to date. The way in which civil society can engage with the Security Council includes lobbying on resolutions. So, the members of the council work together similarly to the Human Rights Council to develop resolutions. Civil society can lobby governments in terms of the content of those resolutions. Also, when the Security Council meets to discuss a specific country situation, one civil society briefer is invited to those discussions to brief the Security Council on the human rights situation in that country. So, for example, a session on Yemen would include one civil society representative to present information on that situation. One of the things that I think is important to think about in terms of civil society briefers is that this person is coming from a place, in conflict or pre-conflict or post-conflict, and there's a lot of security issues to take into consideration with that person traveling to the UN, traveling to a place where they could be in the same room with representatives from their government. So there's a lot of elements in terms of security and how to address those when the civil society briefer does attend the Security Council. So that's all we're going to say on the Security Council. As we've said before, if you have specific questions on the Security Council, be sure to send them through in the way that Hannah has suggested or will suggest. And we're happy to provide information or answer them as best as we can. So the next body that we wanted to talk about is the Third Committee. So the Third Committee is one of the 6 main committees of the General Assembly, and the General Assembly is one of the main committees of the UN. So the Third Committee addresses human rights, humanitarian affairs, and social matters. In a way, it functions quite similarly to the Human Rights Council, and so lots of the things that you learnt in your previous sessions on the Human Rights Council can come into play here. So state members negotiate resolutions on particular issues, such as there's a resolution every 2 years on human rights defenders. There's also resolutions on violence against women, also resolutions on extrajudicial executions. So these resolutions, as they are in the Human Rights Council, set out the commitments of governments on particular issues. And they can be adopted by consensus. They can also be adopted by a vote if there isn't consensus on the content of the resolution. There are also side events run by state and civil society during the session, as there are in the Human Rights Council. So if you have issues you want to bring particular attention to, you can hold an event at the Third Committee session. The one distinction here is that at the Human Rights Council, you can hold a side event and get a room at the UN without a government sponsorship. In New York, you need government sponsorship because only a government can request to book a room at the UN. There are general debates on particular issues, as well as interactive dialogues with special procedures mandate holders. So where governments are coming together and having conversations on specific issues, and when special procedures mandate holders come to the Third Committee, present their reports, and then there is time to have a conversation about those with government representatives within that space at the Third Committee. One thing interesting to note there is that there's no ability for civil society to take part in those conversations with special procedures or in those general debates. So while at the Human Rights Council, those conversations happen and both states and civil society can make statements, in the Third Committee, only states can make statements. So that the bilateral conversations you're having with states are even more important in the Third Committee to try and get our allies and supportive states to make calls and make specific statements in line with our advocacy calls. because we don't have the ability to make those comments ourselves. The Delegates Lounge is something I wanted to speak about. So most diplomats spend time between formal discussions in the Delegates Lounge, which is not open to civil society. So unless we're invited and escorted in by a diplomat, we can't be in that space. So as you know, in Geneva, diplomats spend a lot of time in the Serpentine Cafe, which is an open space, open to civil society as well. This means it's much easier to approach a diplomat with certain issues at the council as compared to the third committee, because we're just not in that same kind of informal spacing. You can't go up or be in the same line with a diplomat as you're ordering coffee. The other thing is that the third committee meets once a year, so every kind of October, November, and the session is a longer session than in Geneva. Just to kind of continue on this vein of some of the differences between the council and the third committee. So the council is focused solely on human rights issues, whereas the third committee also looks at humanitarian affairs and social matters. And as I alluded to previously as well, civil society is more restricted. So we can't make verbal or written statements during the third committee. We need UN state members to help us to get a room booking for a side event. The other key issue is that we're not technically welcome into informal discussions and negotiations. So this is actually a little complex. So while there is no rule that civil society can't attend those informal negotiations on resolutions, there is also no rule that says we can specifically attend. So the fact that there is nothing saying either one way or the other can be used by some governments, and particularly governments not necessarily open or friendly to civil society, to try and restrict us being in the room, which restricts our ability as civil society to hear the conversations and dialogues happening between states on specific issues. This is something that we as an organisation, ISHR, are really lobbying for, and lobbying our kind of friendly governments to push for, and asking them to, by way of example, invite civil society into the room, and also in conversations with state, acknowledge that there is no rule saying NGOs can't be there, so therefore they can. One other thing that I think is important to note about the third committee is the relationship that it has with the Human Rights Council. So some states try to argue that decisions of the Human Rights Council need to be approved by the third committee. This, as you would have seen from the mapping that we showed you previously, this isn't technically correct, and isn't something that we as an organisation would support. So both bodies themselves are subsidiaries of the General Assembly, and the third committee is not the parent body of the Human Rights Council. Nevertheless, some states have tried to use the third committee to block developments at the Human Rights Council. So as you would have learned in the other session, the Human Rights Council has 47 members on a rotating basis. The third committee has all 191 states of the UN that are part of the conversations. So this means that, when we're lobbying, we don't have 47 states to lobby, we have 191 states to lobby, and every state has exactly the same voting power as the other state. So the arguments made sometimes is, the council resolution is something adopted only by 47 states, we're 191, we need to approve it. Again, as I said, this is not an argument that ISHR supports. But I'm going to give an example of where there has been an attempt to block developments of the Human Rights Council, and why it's important in certain cases to be aware of that intention, sometimes by governments, and when lobbying for things and developments at the UN, specifically on those a little bit more controversial, it's important to keep in mind this other space that exists. So in 2016, the special procedure mandate of the independent expert on violence and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity was created at the Human Rights Council. So given this subject matter, this was a very contentious decision, and the vote on the resolution at the council passed only by a small margin. This was something that, civil society had been working towards for quite a long time, and we had been lobbying governments to push for this to pass within the Human Rights Council. And when it happened, it was a huge success. At the same time, it was a small margin, so it was quite controversial. And each year at the third committee, a resolution is presented to the third committee, which notes the annual report of the Human Rights Council. So generally this resolution is simply, the resolution of the third committee simply notes the annual report of the Human Rights Council. However, in this instance, the third committee was in session in 2016, that same year after the independent experts mandate was created. A group of African states made an attempt to challenge the creation of the mandate, arguing that there was no legal basis for the creation of the mandate and that needed to be considered. They did this by noting that all the decisions made by the Human Rights Council that year were noted, except for the creation of the mandate of the independent expert. So in seeking to do this, it then brought a vote to the third committee, and we had done a lot of lobbying along with civil society partners because we had been, there was a sense that this may occur, to lobby governments to assure that if a challenge was made, that there was enough support within the third committee to successfully oppose that challenge. And there was, but this attempt was made, and it was a big fight that then came to the third committee of the General Assembly. So while this is very unusual, as I said, the third committee is not the parent body of the Human Rights Council. And even the resolution presenting the annual report of the Human Rights Council is quite complicated and political. We wanted to share this story with you because it's something to keep in mind. And those of you that perhaps were involved in that campaign on the development of the independent expert would have had a kind of a little bit of insight into the way that this works and the way that there can be attempts to challenge Human Rights Council developments. And as I said, very, very rarely does this happen, but it's useful to have in mind. We've got a couple of photos here of the different times in which the independent expert was being negotiated and lobbied at the council. The photo of the umbrellas is in 2014 during a resolution being passed at the Human Rights Council. The photo just to the left of that at the bottom is in 2016. It's in room 20 when the resolution was adopted to create the mandate of the independent expert. The then photo on the top right, that is in 2019 at the Human Rights Council when there needed to be a resolution to renew the mandate. So while it was still very controversial, we had to really push and lobby and fight for the mandate to be renewed. It did get passed with more support. And then the top left photo, that's in the third committee in 2019 when we again kind of had to reignite our global coalition to make sure that if there was a challenge once again brought, that we could oppose it successfully. And in 2019, it wasn't opposed, so that was great. So that's the third committee. As I said previously, this is one of the bodies that we engage with quite a lot at ISHR. And so any questions on how that works, how advocacy is done there, anything like that, please do let us know. We're more than happy to answer any questions. And if you do find yourself in a situation where you maybe be coming to the third committee as well, we would support you in some advocacy activities there. We also do have a handbook on the third committee that we've developed for NGOs to help to kind of create a bit more of an understanding of how to engage and lobby at the third committee. And so we've shared that with the resources as well. So now we're going to talk about the NGO committee. This is, from my perspective, one of the strangest bodies at the UN. It's one of those bodies where you sit in the room and listen to the conversations that are happening and kind of quite shocked at the conversations that you're hearing happen. So this committee is responsible for granting accreditation to NGOs. So that is granting the right for NGOs to engage with the UN. ISHR has accreditation to engage with the UN. It means we can access UN building, make verbal statements in certain UN sessions. And some of your organizations may also have accreditation. And it's if you were to come to the Human Rights Council, we would be able to accredit you through our accreditation to come into the room and to, to speak and to monitor and observe some of the conversation. But the committee that monitors and kind of determines accreditation status of NGOs is quite complex. So first we're going to start by playing a short video on the NGO committee, just to give you a bit of a sense of its functioning, as well as some concerns with the political elements that are at play there in that body.
The United Nations needs civil society. The UN Charter acknowledges NGOs' participation in the United Nations. Non-governmental organizations monitor and report on whether human rights are respected in their communities. They submit information, make statements, and hold events in human rights bodies of the UN. To participate most fully, NGOs need consultative status. Applications for such accreditation are reviewed by the UN's NGO Committee. This 19-member committee is a key gateway for NGOs into the UN. The job of the NGO committee is to make sure that only NGOs that act in conformity with the spirit, purposes, and principles of the United Nations receive consultative status. However, political interests are very evident in the committee's practice. The membership is dominated by states with an interest in keeping some NGOs out of the UN. Increasingly, the committee lives up to its reputation as the anti-NGO committee. The NGO committee meets twice a year to review applications. And when a member needs more information about an applicant, they can ask a question. When a question is asked, the application is deferred to the next session.
I thank the distinguished representative of China for your question that will be transmitted to the organization so that the committee is duly informed as to the responses received.
Perpetual questioning, however, can just be a procedural tactic to block NGOs. There are questions asked that in theory could be asked forever.
We kindly ask the organization to provide the committee with their recent projects and activities.
We want to ask this NGO to provide the newest financial statements.
Okay, back to you, Tess.
Thank you so much. 1 second.
And just a note to the participants that we will share that video on Blackboard as well, so feel free to take a look at that if you want to view the whole video, which is about 9 minutes long.
Yeah, and just to emphasize that, hopefully that did come through. We had given you a specific section of the video to watch that we thought really helpfully explains its functioning, and it was a useful insight into the functioning of the NGO committee. We'll also list that specific time frame potentially for you. So if you don't want to watch the entire thing, that's the most useful part of that video to watch. But as you can see, there's some significant issues with the current functioning of the NGO committee. So one of the main issues is its membership. It has 19 members, and you'll see on the screen that they're all listed there. Those members generally supportive of civil society participation are highlighted in blue. So there are a total of 3. So Brazil is one that, when they first came on to the NGO committee, they were quite supportive of civil society participation, and now with the current administration, much less so. So you can also see the way in which states that come onto bodies kind of change depending on the administration. We're seeing a similar thing as well with the US at the moment, where they were once very strong allies on LGBTI issues, on civil society, and now on women's rights and sexual reproductive health and rights. So we're definitely seeing a change there. There's no cap on the time period in which states can be a member of the NGO committee as well. And so some, such as China, have been there essentially for 25 years on this committee. ISHR monitors every session of the committee to highlight what's taking place at the committee. And research from our monitoring indicates that human rights NGOs are half as likely to receive accreditation as other NGOs. So essentially, governments aren't particularly interested in accrediting NGOs that will highlight their less than decent human rights records to other countries. So you'll see that in those situations, that particular government will ask a question of the NGO, which essentially defers that application. Some applications have been deferred for 10 years and NGOs are still trying to receive accreditation. We also assist NGOs to navigate the NGO committee when they're seeking accreditation. So if your organisation is seeking accreditation, please do reach out to us because we're very happy to support in navigating this complicated process and figuring out ways in which we can hopefully ensure that NGO does receive accreditation as the outcome of that. I think the kind of final point I'll make on the NGO committee is that it's not exciting work necessarily. It's a little bit hard to encourage states to want to be members of the NGO committee because it's a lot of paperwork. It's a lot of the applications coming through for accreditation. Organisations working on education, on kind of access to water, on kind of less controversial issues. So the time in which it gets kind of interesting politically is when human rights NGOs are coming through the system, but a lot of the work they're doing is not the most exciting. And so it is a bit of we do have to really, really lobby governments to try and encourage them to want to be on this committee because it's such an important committee in terms of the scope and extent of engagement by civil society at the UN. So the next thing we're going to discuss is the Commission on the Status of Women. So I'd be really interested if any of you have participated in the Commission on the Status of Women because this is one of the bodies at the UN where often we get heard up as that have either participated themselves or members of their organisation have previously participated. This is the UN organ promoting gender equality and the empowerment of women. So it meets every March for 12 days, and it is one of the largest gatherings of civil society. So over 1,000 human rights defenders and activists come to New York in March to attend this session. This means that the side conversations, networking, and connecting are an integral part of CSW. The way that it functions is that it has general discussions in which it discusses progress and gaps in the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. The key global policy document, the Beijing Declaration, for those of you not familiar with that, this is the key global policy document on gender equality. It also is a space to discuss emerging issues that affect gender equality and the empowerment of women. In terms of civil society engagement, NGOs can make verbal statements during the open CSW sessions. We can also hold side events sponsored by states if they are going to take place within the UN building. But many CSW side events also take place outside the UN. So if you're here in New York for a CSW session, there are kind of events happening all over the place. It's such a beautiful space to be in, to attend all these different events held by partners from all over the globe. Member states also negotiate and agree on further actions to accelerate progress and promote women's enjoyment of their rights in political, economic, and social fields. These are contained in the main outcome document of CSW, which is called the Agreed Conclusions. So these agreed conclusions set out government commitments on gender equality and women's rights. So as civil society, we lobby governments on what should be included in the agreed conclusions. But generally this has to take place bilaterally or online, as we're not allowed in the room where these negotiations are taking place unless you're part of a government delegation. So this is one of the bodies at the UN where government representatives from the national level often travel to New York to participate in discussions, and some governments will include NGOs in the delegations. And that means they can be in the room and can be listening to the conversations and the negotiations on the agreed conclusions. Given that CSW is focused on gender equality and women's rights, it's quite a sensitive space. So there are many NGOs that attend the sessions that are allies and working towards progress in these rights. But there are also many conservative groups that attend sessions pushing a much more conservative agenda. For example, those that are anti-abortion or anti-LGBTIQ, which means that the space can become quite polarized. And as progressive NGOs, we've needed to come together as a community to support each other and take steps to make sure the space is safe. In particular, when conservative groups have been known in the past to use intimidation tactics to silence our voices. So again, with the other bodies, if you have more questions on the Commission on the Status of Women, please do send them through. Again, we're trying to just give you a bit of an understanding of the mechanisms and what it focuses on, and a little bit of an insight into how we engage in it. But again, acknowledging this is sort of quite brief little summaries we're sharing with you. So the final body we wanted to talk about was the High Level Political Forum. This is the High Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. This is held each July in New York. It's the mechanism which monitors the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is a process that largely fits under the umbrella of ECOSOC, which you would have seen in that initial slide. So during the High Level Political Forum, there are conversations by states on specific sustainable development goals and how they can best be implemented and how they should be implemented. There are also voluntary national reviews that take place as part of the High Level Political Forum. This is where states that have signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals present on the way in which they've implemented the Sustainable Development Goals in their country. There's also a process by which NGOs can input into those national reviews. And to give you a bit of a sense, they operate similarly to the reviews under the Universal Periodic Review, which you'll all be quite familiar with now. However, one of the differences is there's no obligation to be reviewed. So it's not like the UPR where every certain number of years each country is reviewed on all their human rights. Alternatively, at the High Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, countries nominate themselves or volunteer to be reviewed and present information on how they're implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, and NGOs can also feed in information there. One of the other things that's interesting to note about the High Level Political Forum is that rather than engaging as an independent NGO, civil society are organised into major groups. And these are required to engage in those groups. So, for example, NGOs working on the rights of women, farmers, businesses, NGOs. So these groups then kind of collaborate and come together, these groups containing, a number of different NGOs that come together to work on a specific issue, and they can make verbal statements, but on behalf of the major group. So it's a little bit different in terms of engagement. And this is one of the younger mechanisms of the UN, obviously developed after the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. Some of you may have engaged at the High Level Political Forum previously, or your organisations also. And it is one, because of the way these major groups operate, there is access to engage with the High Level Political Forum from wherever you are through these major groups that are often coordinated by a couple of NGOs. So we've thrown a huge amount of information at you in this session. I think for me, this is one of the hardest HERDAP sessions I find, because the idea is to give you a sense of the way in which all these mechanisms operate, but they all have different processes. They all have different purposes. They all have slightly different ways in which civil society can engage. They all have different functions. And so, as we said at the start, there is no intention for you to now have an understanding of how to engage in any of these mechanisms, but simply for you just to have an understanding of, what they are. They sit in New York. They're part of this bigger framework of mechanism, a framework of the mechanisms which look at different human rights issues. And if there is a moment when you may be coming to New York, or there's an opportunity to engage in any of these mechanisms, we're here and really open to having conversations with you, connecting you with partners who may be doing more on your specific issue at those different spaces. And I think, just to have a bit of a sense of of what we're doing there also. We've have in this final slide some additional resources for you that are available. You know, I put in there at the final section some videos on the independent expert process for those of you that are interested in learning a little bit more about that. It includes videos in both 2016 and 2019, and also some more kind of resources on specific processes. So we have a handbook on the NGO committee for NGOs to engage with, and we also have a handbook on the third committee to enhance and help NGOs to engage with these spaces, because these were 100% spaces that were previously so foreign and we just didn't have very much access to. So as I said, please send through any questions you have on anything discussed here in the Blackboard process for sending through questions. And yeah, we're happy to continue to discuss and to respond to any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Tess, for that presentation. And I think, as you mentioned, this was definitely our intent was to present an overview of the mechanisms in New York. And so, as defenders, you can and should be aware of what exists and maybe some of the politics behind it and the opportunities that you might have for advocacy, but also a lot of the challenges and the very real obstacles that we face in engaging with them. So I think it's really important to establish that. And so thank you, Tess, for walking through the different bodies with us today. And as Tess mentioned, if you have one of the bodies or one of the mechanisms that you think could be relevant to your work, please do write or ask more questions in the forum discussion, or feel free to speak to your coach about that, or to contact me and I can facilitate for the discussions as well. So that's definitely a discussion that we can continue on from there. But thank you very much, Tess, for this presentation, and Marina for your support as well in putting this together. And I will see you, our participants, for our next webinar. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.